So my name is Dr. Rosario, and I am a biology professor at Westchester University. And so in Bio 259, Human Anatomy and Physiology, we've started to move away from learning about the muscles and learning more about the nervous system. So the brain, the spinal cord, and actually we just went over spinal nerves. And so as I was looking over my notes, I found a couple of good images that I do want to go over. So I thought, this might be a good time to figure it out. So when we're talking about the spinal nerves, what we're really talking about are the parts of the nerves that are extending from the spinal cord going out into the peripheral nervous system. And so there's some really interesting anatomy and physiology going on when it comes to the ventral part versus the dorsal part. It can be a little bit hard to distinguish through different figures. So we're going to go through a couple of those today. But before we do that, I need to get some lunch. So we're going to go over to get some food from the food truck, and then we'll go back in my office and we'll go through those figures. All right, so I did just put in my order, and I got a couple of minutes, I think, before my falafel wrap is ready. So let's just start talking about these peripheral nerves, right? I mentioned that the roots are the parts that directly connect off the central nervous system, and those roots are very much separated by their function. So we have ventral roots. Ventral is being at the front of the spinal cord, the front of the human body. Those are all going to be motor information. So our brain sending information from our brain down the spinal cord, out the ventral roots, eventually out to our muscles. The dorsal side is very different though. The dorsal roots themselves are actually just there for sensory information. We know that because of a very specific structure known as the dorsal root ganglion, the DRG. Sometimes it's called the DRG, sometimes it's called something else. I do want to give you a couple of images to show you just the variability in how we can label that structure, but it just looks like a big bubble that is going to house all of the cell bodies from those sensory neurons, bringing information to our spinal cord, eventually up to our brain. Now, the other thing that I do want to mention, even before we look at any of these figures, are that after the roots, all of the information gets mixed up. When you're actually talking about a peripheral nerve or just a nerve in general, those nerves are going to contain motor information going out and sensory information coming in. They're going to act like basically this two-lane highway for sending and receiving information to different parts of the body. So once we start talking about peripheral nerves, all of that information is mixed. But as we get closer and closer and closer to the spinal cord, we're actually going to see the roots, which are going to be strictly motor information at the front or strictly sensory information at the back. All right, so I do want to pay attention because I don't know when they're going to call my number, but we'll go back in my office and we'll take a look at some of the figures that demonstrate these anatomical structures. Okay, so that was a very delicious falafel wrap. Now we can get down to some science, right? So I have, first of all, a figure of a spinal cord, and I'm showing you the lateral view. I know it's a lateral view basically because we have these things sticking off to the side, forming our ventral and dorsal roots, and finally our spinal nerve where they all kind of connect and mix together. Right, so we know that this is a side view because we see all this information. The next question that you should be asking yourself is, well, if we know this is a side view, what's the front and what's the back? Right, and the one thing that I look for every single time consistently is this structure right here. If we let that fade away for a second, that structure is a little bit like a bubble. It's enlarged a little bit, and that houses all of the cell bodies for the sensory neuron. So if I can just draw this very quick, the sensory neuron is actually going to be going into the spinal cord that way, and we're going to have cell bodies that are sticking off to the side in this structure known as the dorsal root ganglion. I like looking at the structure because if you can identify it, that also tells you where the dorsal part of the figure is, right? Here's the bubble. That's your dorsal root ganglion. That means that this is the dorsal part of the body. Now, if you look at this figure, we see that this is named posterior root and the spinal ganglion. So these things do have different terms, but I prefer to call this the dorsal root ganglion, showing you the dorsal part of the spinal cord. Okay, so there is the dorsal part. That means that over here we have the ventral part, and they're all going to mix together. Right? So as I mentioned outside, the ventral part is always going to have motor information going out, and the dorsal side is always going to have sensory information going in. right? It's only here at the spinal cord, or it's only here at the spinal nerve where both of that information starts to mix together. Okay, let's look at a couple of other structures. Here's another figure, one that looks much more familiar to what we've seen in lecture. This is a superior or top-down view of the spinal cord. So there is your spinal cord right here, part of the central nervous system. But if you pay really close attention, you'll see that we have the root coming out here and another root coming out here. How do you tell the difference between the ventral root and the dorsal root? Look for the dorsal root ganglion. Dorsal root ganglion right there, nice little bubble. It has that cell body sticking out to the side. You know that this is going to have sensory information coming into the spinal cord. Okay, what else do we see here? This is named an afferent fiber. So remember, afferent means you're bringing information towards. In this case, the nerve is bringing sensory information towards the central nervous system, towards the spinal cord, towards the brain. Information this way is a one-way street once we're talking about these roots over here. Okay, so let's follow this. This actually shows us an interneuron right in between. This is actually showing a polysynaptic arc. Polysynaptic meaning many synapses. Here's one synapse right there. Here's another synapse right there. That can only happen if you have an interneuron connecting the two. Another thing that we see here that we haven't really talked about before is the fact that information is crossing from one side of the body to the other. Right here you can see sensory information coming from the right side of the body and finally crossing over to the left-hand side of the body. This happens all the time. We'll see this a lot when we look at pathways and specific pathways of neurons and information in between the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. But just for now, know that that's a common thing that can happen. Okay, so what do we see? Sensory information coming in. We have an interneuron bringing that information to the other side of the body, and it's leaving out the ventral root. Right, so there's the ventral root. It's sending information out. We call these efferent fibers, right? So efferent basically means sending away. And why would you want to send away information from the brain outwards? It's because you want to send motor information to a muscle or send motor information to a gland. This is basically your central nervous system controlling another cell. And again, these are called effector cells. They're muscle cells or glands. So again, once we see the root here, we know that this is all motor information. We know that there's all sensory information up here. And then kind of one thing that's missing from this that I do want you to know, once we get to the root, once we get to the nerve itself, all of the information kind of gets mixed up. Okay, we got one more figure for you today. And this one has no labels and shows you kind of the same information, but I do want to just go over it one more time. First of all, what are we looking at? How do we know what we're looking at? We see that this is the spinal cord, and if you can't identify spinal cord very easily, I kind of think that the gray matter in the middle kind of looks like a Under Armour symbol or like a butterfly. So here you can see there's like a little butterfly structure over there. That's very indicative that we're looking at the spinal cord. But even more important, we see bubble, right? And not only do we see the bubble, we also see cell body, which is actually what causes that bubble to form. So we know dorsal root ganglion, sensory neuron. And what is this actually doing? Well, let's just do a really quick review if you don't remember. This is actually our skin. We see at the top line, this is our epidermis up here. This is our dermis down there. Here's the separation between epithelial tissue up top and connective tissue down there at the bottom, forming the dermis. And we didn't really talk about this, but that is a sensor that is able to sense touch or vibration. So if you touch your skin, you basically activate this sensory receptor, which sends an action potential propagation that forms sensory information to the spinal cord, and eventually this rises up to the brain, where then your brain processes this and understands this as being touched or being felt or some kind of vibration. Okay? So we know that all of this is sensory information, right? Coming in from the dorsal root all the way back in, up to the brain. We also just call this ascending information. It kind of makes sense, right? To ascend means to go higher. And in this case, information is going higher because why would it want to go higher? It wants to get to your brain. Sensory information that we feel, that we're conscious of, goes to a very specific part of our cerebral hemisphere, so it goes up. All right, so why don't we take a look at the other side? Down here, we can see an arrow going down. This is what we call descending information. Why would you want descending information? Because your brain is sending some signal down your spinal cord out to your effector cells, again, to your muscles or your glands. Okay, so we know that that information is not going to exit out this part, right? This is not an exit at all. We know that the only way that motor information can leave is through this ventral root over here. And what we can see is at this ventral root, it goes out into the spinal nerve and then eventually innervates skeletal muscle cells. Right, so again, this is something that we've studied a lot. We're not going to pay too much attention to what's going on down here, but I do want you to pay attention to the fact that motor information goes out of the front part of the spinal cord through these ventral roots and eventually merges with information that formed a mixed peripheral nerve, mixed because it's going to have sensory information and motor information. Okay, so that was 3 different figures that show you some of the intricacies of the spinal cord and also of the spinal nerves. Hopefully that was helpful for you all. Let me know if there's any other topics that I can cover in these figures. Happy to do so. And if you found this helpful at all, please come to class. All right, I'll see you on the lecture.